Good, how are you?
Excellent. The first reading, I think, was pretty straightforward. Doesn't require too much philosophical background. Whenever there are readings that require some philosophical background, oftentimes I'll address that leading up to it. Other times we'll be talking about them in class to kind of clarify some of the concepts. We'll see that with a little bit with William James, and in particular on the 28th when we look at Norman Malcolm's work on the groundlessness of belief, in particular looking at a Wittgensteinian approach, which is to say of or relating to Wittgenstein. Anna is here. But as it is, this is, I think, a decent introductory reading into getting at a lot of the issues that we'll be getting at throughout the semester. It touches on Marx, it touches on Freud, touches on a few other readings that are connected to, and that we will get to later on in the semester. But before I get to that, I want to say a few more things about, oops, is that right? PC. Is that working? There it is. I want to say a couple more things about the introductory material that I didn't get to last time. We cut it short a bit. And I think I covered everything I wanted to on the syllabus, but before I move on and get into a little bit more of this question, I'm skipping through a few things that are in the slides. Remember, you have access to all the slides. They're PDF files, so you should be able to access them no problem online. If you have difficulty, let me know. But the syllabus, you all had a chance to go through it. I actually don't have any more. This is my last one, so if you need one, it is online, or I can bring you one next time. Does anyone have any questions about the syllabus? I think we went through the whole thing, but now I don't remember if we covered it all.
Quizzes. They're not on the syllabus, the schedule.
Quizzes will be almost entirely in class.
Okay.
Very good. So this class is not too large. It's a little bit too large to do all writing assignments. That's how I used to do philosophy classes in the good old days when they allowed for smaller sized classrooms. That's not happening now. There's a budget crisis, so they're actually pushing to have larger sized classes, fewer classes, but with more students. That's not helpful. Unfortunately, your tests will be part essay and part multiple choice. Again, it's hard to do philosophy multiple choice questions, but if you're clever about it and you do it right, you can get some of the kinds of questions out. So the quizzes will be predominantly short answer in class, oftentimes in groups, sometimes individually, but I've set it so that there's no, I don't think I have any multiple choice quizzes, but the part of the test will be multiple choice. So that's a good question.
They're just random whenever you decide to have them?
Yes. Are they just random? Well, they'll appear random to you, but not to me. In that way, I'm like Leibnizian sense of God. No, I was kidding. Well, I'm not really. There's an analogy there, which will make sense later in the semester. Leibniz has a conception of deduction and certainty, but I'll get to that later. What you'll find, discussions and quizzes, these, we typically, the day that we'll have a quiz, group work, we won't have a discussion group, in class. So I try to break it up, and I won't have group discussion on the same day that we have a quiz. So I want to have interaction among the students, but not overlapping too much. So they kind of you kind of see when each of them is, but they're not online, the quizzes. That's going to be in class. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you just answered my question.
I'm curious what it was, though.
What, are the quizzes online or not?
Correct. So, right. If you miss a day in which we do in-class work, I'll have it available to you for partial credit that you can submit individually online. But other than that, it's going to be in class. Right. And so you don't have a discussion until next reading. So if you look at your syllabus, which you should all have with you, how many have laminated your syllabi? I'm not entirely sure, but somebody did it once, and I thought, that's awesome. I can't believe you laminated my syllabus. That way it's protected. You can keep it with you, pull it out, you got a keg party, whatever. The beer washes right off of the syllabus, and then you can see, oh, I need to get to studying after you're done drinking. Next class is the 21st. There's no class on the 20th, but we do a class on the 21st. The Ethics of Belief with Clifford, and you will have an assignment related to that, and that's posted here. Let me just go over that since we're discussing this. You click on it. Don't let this fool you. This is just information for those who've not submitted anything online before through Canvas. This is just to clarify how to do that. And this is the assignment. Each of these readings has questions in the back of the reading. You need to pick one of those questions to address as best you can, answer that, submit it, and then be in class. So, for instance, on the 21st, be in class to discuss the Clifford reading with others. Usually I'll do those discussions at the beginning of class so that you want to make sure you're here. If you miss those discussions, you miss those points. But they're relatively easy points to the extent that you're here and discussing it. Okay, what else do I need to say about the syllabus that is unclear, if anything? Any other questions about the syllabus? Did I talk about cell phones? Do I need to talk about cell phones? I don't need to talk about cell phones, do I?
No. You
Why?
said to keep them out.
That's
never,
right.
Don't
Never.
Be on it.
Yeah, ever.
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 I prefer you use carrier pigeons. I'd rather birds try to fly in here, slam into the window to bring you a message. Oh, that was for me. It's probably not going to happen, but I prefer that than so. I don't have a smartphone. Maybe that's foolish. Actually, it is a little bit foolish. I was really wishing I had one with a GPS in it because I was in a car rental that didn't have GPS in a city I didn't know. I had instructions, directions of where to go. Believe this or not, written down. No, just on a piece of paper that I wrote down. Isn't that primitive? Because you have to drive, then look, or memorize ahead of time, which is ridiculous. Who does that? And guess what happened? Of course I did. Of course I got lost. We are indebted to the scientific developments of technology, but I don't know that it's made our lives better. I don't know that it's given us meaning. I don't know that it's made us any more wise. Has it made us happier, the gadgets that we have?
On our own brain.
In a way, we're less reliant. Well, that's an interesting debate. I don't want to. It's tangentially related to the discussions here. Maybe it enables us to worry about things that are philosophical in nature that we wouldn't be able to just look up and Google.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, we don't have to think much about phone numbers. We just hit.
It actually dulls your mind. Like 10
Oh.
minutes on a cell phone makes it really hard to philosophize.
What if you're reading philosophy on your cell phone?
Get a
People do.
Kindle.
Yeah, okay. I encourage the actual text. The smell of books is something that I've always enjoyed, older books in particular.
Will we have any primary text, or are we just using a reader?
Just this.
Okay.
This is huge. But the readings are relatively short, and in some of the cases, I think they're actually too short. I might bulk it up with other documents on it, and the class discussions will expand on what's there. Okay, let me just, again, wrap up. Any other questions on the syllabus? I'll say a little bit about the statement of collaboration that I wrote out on the syllabus at the end of this first part. So I want to wrap up our discussion from last time on the introductory comments of philosophy of religion. First of all, I'm not going to define this. I'm not going to really attempt to define it in the sense that philosophers attempt to define things, seeking out the, what are they called? What is it?
Necessary and sufficient.
Yeah, I don't like to give the answer. I like to pull it out. That's what education in Socrates' sense is, to educe, to draw out necessary and sufficient conditions. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a religion? That is to say, if it's missing this condition, this necessary condition, it's not a religion. And if it has these conditions, they're jointly sufficient. To give you a simple example, I want to define what a chair is. Here's a chair. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for defining a chair? That's actually really hard to do, as some of you know from previous philosophy classes. Sometimes a beanbag is called a chair. In fact, they sell it at IKEA, and it's called a beanbag chair. That's weird because it doesn't seem to have any of the criteria of anything else that we would call a chair. This seems trivial, innocuous, but that kind of conceptual analysis that philosophers love to do, we'll look at this with a lot of other concepts, it's tough to apply to all concepts. The idea of a religion may be impervious to this kind of conceptual analysis. It may be the case that there just aren't necessary and sufficient conditions such that we can define a religion in a way that here are the conditions, they are necessary and jointly sufficient. So, to clarify, for a human being to be alive and stay alive, there are certain conditions that are required. I need oxygen. That is to say, oxygen is necessary to stay alive. Is it sufficient? Is it enough? No. You need...
Friends.
Oh, I was going to go with water, but you went with friends first. Good. Friends, that's nice. Really? I guess. That's the guy from Castaway. He was without anyone, but
He started
then...
talking to a coconut.
Wilson, volleyball. Not a coconut. That would be ridiculous. But a volleyball. Maybe, yeah, friendship. That's good. Aristotle might agree with that too. So we need water, and then friends, and then oxygen, in this order. Food, and so forth. Those are necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. And you might add another one. If any one of those is missing, you're gone. And one of them by themselves is insufficient. We're looking for the necessary and sufficient conditions. And sometimes you can find those and it's pretty easy. In order to move an object, you need to apply force. Force, scientifically speaking, seems to be a both necessary and sufficient condition to bring about the movement of an object. How we define a religion, I don't know what you would start with as necessary. Because there are, if you've taken a comparative religion classes or a world religions class, you know that there are many instances of examples of religion. In fact, Houston Smith, I'm going to give you a variation of this from Houston Smith. In his book, The World's Religions, he takes what is known in philosophy as the Wittgensteinian approach, based on the philosophy of Wittgenstein. In other words, a family resemblance approach. It's not the case that there are necessary and sufficient conditions for a religion. Likewise, to use Wittgenstein, German philosopher, who we'll look at briefly coming weeks, there may not be necessary and sufficient conditions for defining a game. He uses that example. What qualifies as a game, and only a game? We want a definition that's necessary and sufficient. We want a definition of a game. Well, golf is a game. So is chess. So is solitaire. So is... That's all the ones I can think of. There are others, obviously. But notice, what is it about all of them that fits them under the umbrella concept of a game? Solitaire is totally different than soccer. They both start with S.
None of them have long-term consequences that could really change your life. A game just means it's contained, it's idealized, it's imaginative.
It has to be all of those. Why? Could we find a counterexample in which... That's what you look for necessary and sufficient conditions.
What do you mean by family resemblance? He goes about defining religion by the way families are structured? What does that mean?
Good. No. The way that I resemble my son, and he resembles his mom, and my daughter resembles me. My daughter has my nose. I don't know if that's true, but for example, but she doesn't have my hair, right?
Okay.
So that's what he means by... So all religions, Houston Smith, borrowing from Wittgenstein, would say, have some elements of authority, ritual, speculation, tradition, grace, or mystery. You can add to this list or remove it. You can amend it. It may be that some religions lack authority and have merely speculation or ritual and so forth. And they have them in varying degrees, according to Houston Smith and other theorists. This is Houston Smith in particular. You had a question.
I forgot.
Just raise your hand and bring it up again if it comes to you. I saw another question over here.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was just going to add on to the game thing.
Okay.
I was just going to say, competition required, kind of defines what a game is.
Can you have a game that is no competition? I mentioned solitaire. I've never actually played solitaire, but I'm told there's no competition.
Playing the cards, kind of, like you're playing against the game.
I guess.
'Cause the game
I don't
can
know.
beat you, and you can beat the game.
Is that true? Okay, so maybe competition is necessary. Is there a counter?
Say entertainment. Like a game has to be entertaining for someone.
Yeah, does it? Okay. I consider argumentation a game. The science of argumentation is logic, and I consider engaging in argument as a kind of game, and there are rules to games. But most people wouldn't consider argument a game. That seems odd. Yet I do. And I think maybe the family resemblance element of this could help. We can apply this in different ways. Did you want to?
Kind of like what you were saying. Everyone needs to know like the rules in order to be in the game. Like you kind of have to know what like the game is and like just everything. Have an understanding.
Right.
An understanding, yeah.
I was trying to teach my son. Some of you know this from a different class. I was trying to teach Milo. He was like 4 or 5 how to play checkers. And he had a play sword with him, and he knocked all the checkers off the board. He said, before he had done that, he had tried to move a piece in a weird way. I said, you can't move that way in checkers. And he said, we're not playing checkers. What? What are we doing? He said, we're playing war. There's a little 4-year-old with a sword. It's a fake sword. It was just funny. But he was playing different games, which is an interesting point, related to argument and related to religion, related to all sorts of things. If we're talking about different things conceptually, we can imagine getting quite confused. Because in some cases, you might find, some elements of Buddhism or Jainism in particular, in which there isn't really authority. There may be speculation, there may be mystery, and there's no divine. Notice this is even leaving out a divinity from Houston Smith's perspective, although it's implied here. Grace is presumed, at least within the Christian tradition, that yes, there's suffering. Yes, it's, as Bloom points out, it's really hard to be a person, but there is what's known as the grace of God, where God intervenes, or some deity intervenes. Not all religions have that. Jains are atheists, and yet they make it into his book on world religions, and so many other books on world religions. And so you have a number of religions that don't have all of those, but have, if you want, a family resemblance. And that may be useful. Should we go with the otherwise arbitrary mode of defining religion based upon what the IRS thinks? It sounds an absurd notion, but what am I talking about with what does the Internal Revenue Service have to do with what a religion is? Did you want to answer that?
We're going to talk about that. I was just going to, I noticed something about the list that you have there. Authority, ritual, speculative, tradition, grace, mystery, they're all sort of incumbent on like belief in the power of those things, right? Mm-hmm. So like authority doesn't really exist. You have to believe in it for it to work.
Let's see.
So
yeah, I think I can see what you're saying. Yeah.
I would say the reason they're also variable in all the religions is because you can't really strictly define the power of each in a culture. So you'll end up getting as many different religions as there are people.
Yes, and that is, to jump to Christianity, that's the Catholic's critique of Protestantism. Right? There are no hierarchies. The individual gets to interpret the Bible for themselves. You've just multiplied religions by the number of people that there are. And that's a problem for Catholics, for example. Right? Martin Luther wanted to demonstrate that, hey, we don't need to go through a priest or some priestly caste is the term that's sometimes used. We should be able to interpret scriptures on our own. And you see variations of this in most faiths. You see splits, schisms within Judaism, within Islam, within Christianity, in who gets to interpret the religious texts, the authority, who are the authority figures, and how is that established. Ritual is broad. That came up last time when we talked about collegism, something like that. How do we distinguish a religious ritual from a non-religious ritual? Scientists engage in rituals to some extent when they invoke the scientific method. For example, one could expand that. But it would be odd, perhaps, to consider science a religion. We'll talk more about that specific divide or overlap today. Speculation, that could be, and he defines that broadly, as I would consider theological or philosophical musings about origins, about purpose, about function, about morality and its origins, among other things. Tradition, we see that isn't always found. Buddhists Theravada Buddhists are less concerned with tradition, many of them, and more concerned with learning from the words of the Buddha and the individual's drive toward achieving, for example, nirvana or enlightenment or nothingness, no-thingness, where tradition is seen as less important. In fact, Martin Luther comes along within Christianity and shows the problems of appealing solely to tradition. However, tradition and ritual oftentimes go hand in hand, and some religions are maintained largely by a kind of systematic retention of tradition. And grace, again, is that intervention of a divinity or divinities. It need not be one single divine, as Hildesberg points out. And then there's the last one he has here. We could, of course, and we will add to this. He discusses it as mystery. And we have to be cautious with this. I brought some works from Einstein we'll talk about later. Einstein talks about mystery, but he talks about the wonder that our recognition of the mysterious is, that it encourages us to study and investigate and learn more. And Einstein speaks of the mystery that scientific underpinnings and discoveries and recognition of our ignorance give rise to in almost religious terms. But I think he's been misconstrued over the years. Some argue, in fact, there's a new, well, not really new anymore, Walter Isaacson has a autobiography on Einstein. And in that, Isaacson tries to paint Einstein as a traditional believer in God. And that's incorrect. Einstein's very clear. Einstein's conception of God is much like that of the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza. And maybe similar to Jefferson or Thomas Paine, who were known as deists, which I'll talk about that briefly today as well. But we have to be cautious with mystery. If we say from the outset, this phenomena that we're trying to study is mysterious, then we end up shutting off conversation. We end up shutting off philosophical investigations into it. And it's not just in religion that this happens. And you can think of what St. Augustine says of the Trinity in Christianity, or of the Incarnation. How is it that God becomes man? That seems impossible. It seems contradictory. It seems absurd. Logically, how do you defend that? It's a mystery. And then we stop thinking about it. If we start with that. Likewise, in the philosophy of mind, there's a guy named Colin McGinn. Granted, he wrote a whole book on this, on consciousness, called The Mysterious Flame. He argues that we can't know about consciousness. It's wholly mysterious to us. That, to many, is dismissive and precludes any kind of philosophical investigations into it. Yeah.
What about like religion as like a shared attitude?
Shared attitude.
Or like ideology or something like that? I don't know.
I guess you can see that as ritual. You can see that as tradition and maybe authority embedded under those broad headings. But surely there's something to that. However, those might not be enough because we can come up with other instantiations that meet that. How did you phrase it again? Sorry.
Attitude.
Yeah.
Like this, I don't know. People say like you have a religious reverence to blah blah blah.
Mm. Well, here's an interesting point about that. I'll briefly talk about Richard Dawkins. You've heard of him before. He's a famous evolutionary biologist. He wrote a book called The God Delusion, so his standpoint's pretty clear. However, I think it was the 150th anniversary of Darwin's release of Origin of the Species, and he had an original copy of it. And it was interesting the way he treated it. Not just because it was old, but he treated it with reverence. He treated it with almost as if it were a religious relic. At least that's how it was described. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's an accurate description. And I think he'd be fine with that. He finds the language of spirituality has been monopolized by religious figures, and it ought not be the case. We ought to be able, as Einstein says, find mystery, and maybe this concept of spirituality has to be unpacked, but we ought to be able to use the language of religiosity in a way that expresses our experience that is without a God, for Dawkins. And so we want to be cautious that we don't define religion in such a way that it's so broad that it includes things that are just not religious. My awe and my reverence for the Chicago Cubs was, I mean, I don't really have that, but people where I lived in Rockford, They were in fact, that's the word they would use, religious. They're religious fanatics with respect to the Cubs. And then the Cubs won the World Series finally, and things changed. Do you all remember that? The Cubs were like cursed. Does any fans of the Cubs? Baseball? Do you know? So you know what I'm talking about. When they finally won, when did they win? A couple years ago? And now it's like not as impressive or cool to be a Cub fan because they finally won it. And I'm not sure if there's something sacred about that that's now become mundane.
You're not an underdog anymore.
They're not. There's something about being the underdog that, yes, I think that's true. Oftentimes, when Milo asks when we're watching the English Premier League football, appropriately named term football, because they're using their feet in soccer. We call it soccer here. And whenever Liverpool is playing, I always go for the other team. Does anyone watch English Premier League? Nobody in this whole class watches the English Premier League? I'm going to stick with the example anyway. Look it up, okay? Liverpool, they're amazing. They're defeating everybody by it's incredible.
Just say that you go to the other team.
I go for the other team. I'm for the underdog, and whoever they're playing is always the underdog. That's not as great a story if nobody cares. Watch some English Premier League, people, okay? And also, The Good Place. That actually is relevant to class. Watch The Good Place. If you haven't seen that yet, I highly encourage it. It's relevant to this class in particular. All right, let's get into more about what we're dealing with. As I mentioned, we'll say more about and try to come to a consensus, perhaps, if possible, whether or not we can define what a religion is. What does it mean to be religious? Well, oftentimes the term is theistic. And I think that's really quite narrow, because one can be religious without believing in a divinity. However, most people who are religious are theists or theists. That is someone who believes in a God. There's a lot of kinds of theism. I think I introduced this last semester in the intro to philosophy class. Some of you have taken that class. You remember this. I may have added a couple here. And there's a great book that addresses these concepts of theism, that gives a history. In fact, it's called A History of God. And that's by Karen Armstrong. I encourage you to look into it. There is some concern that her conception of this history is one of development, such that we start with polytheism and then eventually get to the major religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, for example, as monotheistic, as if it were a transition, a development, a progress, which implies those that are still polytheistic are less progressed. In fact, as I mentioned last time, an early version of Houston Smith's book, The World Religions, referred to the indigenous populations' religions that were oftentimes polytheistic, which I'll define in a moment, as primitive. And that word is obvious. It's dripping with negative connotations. This monotheistic faith, which is well developed and complex, it's kind of like the developed world versus the undeveloped world or something like that. And it has some negative connotations to it. What's polytheism? Many, many gods. That's right. I'm sorry?
Why is monotheism assumed that more complex?
Right. That's a great question.
Because that's more complex when you have many gods.
Why is the conception of monotheism more complex? The argument that Karen Armstrong gives is that it's a historical and philosophical development to move away from a multiplicity of gods to a single God that has certain characteristics, which we will get to. It's too hard to get to now. But Thursday, the 20th of February, when we look at the attributes of God. And I don't know, and we don't have to agree with her. I already pointed out that this may be a little bit question-begging on her part in seeing the development to monotheism as an improvement. That's how it's implied. I don't think she explicitly says it that way. Whether it's more complex, that's actually, I may have misused that term. I don't mean, although she does imply it's philosophically more complex, monotheism, than are most systems of polytheism. But I think that might be a debatable point too. Did you want to add?
I actually haven't read the Karen Armstrong book. I've just been kind of advised not to, but from
Who advised you not to?
just a friend at St. John's
Oh.
where I go.
Okay.
And, but basically, I think when she's making an argument like that, it's in the Western sense when you're talking about like Greek pantheon.
Yeah.
And I think why she's saying there is a sense of, I don't know, maybe it becomes more respectable over time is because you're transitioning from really anthropomorphic. There's like a you're really when you have polytheism, you're kind of creating God in your own image when you're thinking of figures like Zeus and Hera, and then when you have something like Judaism, which is strict monotheism, you're ascribing morality all of a sudden to God, perfect morality. Before that, if you're reading the Odyssey or the Iliad, all of these gods kind of have the same issues humans do. They just happen to have a lot more, I guess, functional power, but they have the same kind of rifts amongst themselves. So I think
This is why Socrates is not a big fan of appealing to the gods for moral concern. We'll return to this at the end of the semester when we look at the Euthyphro. After all, Zeus is not a moral exemplar. I mean, he was known for... What is he most well known for? I think raping women. This is not a god that we'd say, let's do as God does. And so there may be something to that. The anthropomorphism issue is interesting because you see that the philosophical complexities is getting more abstract. Anthropomorphize is to make like people, to give man-like characteristics, human characteristics to the divine. Why? So that we can more easily, readily interact and understand. It's hard to have a personal or any kind of relationship to an abstract philosophical concept. And in Judaism, and then later in philosophical Islam, and then in Christianity as well with people like St. Aquinas, who want to try to maintain a personal relationship with God, but also maintain a philosophically acceptable conception of what God is. It's not easy to do. And when you fall too far into this, the concern is, now you've given God human-like characteristics. You've brought God down to our level. And we'll have to talk. We'll spend a whole lecture on what the historical characteristics or the divine attributes are and why that's such an important element. In any case, polytheism is the belief in a multitude of gods, and there's a lot of reasons why this could be beneficial and understandable. At the time that Abraham and Moses lived, for example, there were multiple gods. In fact, Armstrong makes the case that both Abraham and Moses were probably not monotheistic. This is a controversial claim because those within the tradition, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which are all Abrahamic faiths, they all have the same origins, want to say that they're each monotheistic. But it took a long time for strict monotheism, which is the belief in one God and only one God. It is a historical development. We go from multiple gods and worshiping different gods in different places with different powers, right? They're in a sense tribal and geographical and locational. To, as Armstrong argues, henotheism, which is a kind of polytheism, but you're choosing one out of the many gods that you believe exist to worship. Yes, you're aware of El and Baal and other gods, but, according to Armstrong, Abraham decides to follow Yahweh above all the others. And in fact, the argument she gives is that Abraham, in fact, did worship these other gods in those locations, but eventually signed a covenant with Abraham. In fact, what did he consummate that covenant by doing? Oh, before that.
Was it circumcision?
Yes. Actually, that came up in the... And Bloom mentions that, although he doesn't call it circumcision. He's a bit more graphic in his description. Anyway, we'll talk about that. I think that's when his discussion of fraternities, which is weird, or right on. So henotheism is the belief that there are multiple gods, but you choose just this one. And Moses, she argues, in fact, in one of the commandments, thou shalt not have any other gods before me, or don't worship any other gods but me, is different, she argues, and this is a compelling case. It's different than saying there are no other gods. It's just that you shouldn't be worshiping these others. So that's a henotheistic conception. And as time goes by, we might find more examples of this. We find also pantheism. And this is not a strict linear division or development, but a pantheist, do you remember what pantheism means?
God and everything.
That's right. Or if you want the cosmos, everything is divine, I heard somebody say. Yeah. The cosmos, or everything, is God.
So does this mean that God isn't separate from the creation itself? That is
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, although using the word creation is going to be weird. We're going to see why.
Huh.
Pantheist says everything is God and God is everything. And there's variations of this. I mean, there's so many variations of each of these isms. And this is just an overview of them, and each time we address them perhaps in more detail, as in some of the writings we'll get into it. But the meaning of the term in general pantheism is to say everything is divine, all is God, God is everything. And there's a variation of this in most faiths where we're the spark of the divine, which is not the same thing as saying we are divine. That leads into some sorts of problems for some religions. In fact, it can be deemed heretical to assume that you are divine. But while this has appealed to many who see benefits of taking care of nature, taking care of the environment, right? A pantheistic view very easily can support a kind of environmental conservatism that says we should stop destroying the environment because we're harming the divine in a sense. But there's a problem, this creation question. Where did it all come from? That's a problem for the pantheist. And that is a problem because?
Well, that's the.
Go ahead.
It's like, because there has to be a creation necessarily, or else it's just this paradox. When people say that there was never that God has always been here and He's never going anywhere. And the same thing that we think the Big Bang is the creation of the universe, but we don't know what happened before that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. We are God and we are the universe. Yeah, which came first, and is the circle.
Right. And if we assume there was a time in which the universe did not exist, and it was created, pantheism would be a difficult conception to make sense of that. Because if God is the creator of the universe, but, according to pantheists, God is nature, that means God created himself. Can God create himself? Well, he's God. God can do anything, including the logically impossible. Believe it or not, there's debates about that. And we're going to talk about that with the conception of the characteristics of God. But logically, most philosophers find that to be abhorrent. It violates a basic law of reasoning called the law of non-contradiction. How can God create God's self? That implies God is an effect and the cause. That's logically impossible. You cannot make yourself. Contrary to the fans of Incubus. Any Incubus fans? They have a song called Make Yourself. It's not a great song, but it has it in the title, Make Yourself. Okay, so this is a problem if we want to say that the world was created, but a panentheist could actually make sense of this. Where God is, everything is divine. Wait a minute. Yep. But God is transcendent. Everything is in God. Notice that's different than everything is God. Everything is divine, but God supersedes, is transcendent, and therefore we can talk about God having created the universe. We can still make sense of this as if God has always been, well then so too has the cosmos. That's a logical possibility. Here we're finding God as the cause of the cosmos. It could be the case that there existed God, and then God brought time and space into existence at, I don't know how you phrase that, at some point. Because prior to time and space, you wouldn't say, what time is it? That's a weird thing to say. This had a magnet. Doesn't it? Oh, this one doesn't have a magnet. I'm going to keep doing that for a while, yeah?
So, pantheism, God is everything, and then panentheism, everything is divine, but God is in everything?
Yes. and God is transcendent, above, beyond, outside of, therefore leaving us the possibility that God could have created the cosmos, created everything.
So pantheism is like saying, I believe you are equal to being as holy as God, but then the pantheism.
Did you say assholey?
Yeah, well, you say.
Oh, as holy.
Yeah.
I thought you were calling me assholey. Like an adverb. You're acting asshole. But I'm as holy as.
Yeah, as God, but then the
It's either a cut down or a wow. I'm like, God.
Yeah.
It's one of the two. I'll go with the second. All right.
So the other one is like saying that you are holy, but God is more holy. Because they seem very similar. It's kind of hard to differentiate.
The main difference is this conception of creation being possible, the one and not the other. And it isn't an equation in the sense that another way of putting this is everything is a part of God, right? And if you make it into an equation, then one worries, well, wait a minute, is it wrong of us? Does it make sense to worship God anymore? Because now if we see them all as equal, then why not just worship nature, worship other people, worship ourselves? We can see that as potentially problematic. And so the sense of God being transcendent is necessary to make that distinction. All right, and again, this is a broad overview of these various isms, then I want to get into the Bloom reading. Then there's deism. This came up a moment ago. A deist is somebody who believes God created the universe and then just said, okay, take care, left. The blind watchmaker analogy. The founding fathers, many of whom were unmistakably deists, because deism arose around the Age of Enlightenment. Jefferson clearly was influenced by this, Thomas Jefferson, probably even George Washington, maybe Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, certainly. That is, God does not intervene. And this is a very different view than many of the many people in politics today. Many people in politics back then, they're called our founders. We oftentimes say we need to go back to the values of our founding fathers. Well, what does that mean? Because many of them are deists, and those are very different views than what I think contemporary politicians are considering now, which shows oftentimes, this is the case, a lack of interest in history and how important history is.
So is deism saying that God does not intervene, or that God is absent?
Absent, more in the Aristotelian sense of God not really paying much attention, not cared. That's a good distinction, a very good question, because it's either God is watching, is like, oh my God, another Holocaust, or God's not even there. It's like, I made a watch, and then you broke the watch that I made, but I didn't know that, right? You bring it back to me to get fixed. I'm like, nah, I don't want to fix that. I'm not interested. There's a big difference between a God that created everything and doesn't intervene because he chooses not to for whatever reason, and a God that created everything, the typical deist view, that is no longer interested in it. That's not aware, I guess is the way to put it. And that's typically the second version of it. Although there are variations of this too. And we'll look at this when we look at contemporary philosophy of religion and the problem of suffering after the Holocaust. Where was God during the Holocaust is the question that's asked. And one response is, where was man during the Holocaust, as it turns out? And then there's another response to that. There's a whole conversation that goes on. Yes?
So deism they still believe that like God is the creator of everything now? Like,
yes. So
like the project you or something you don't care about?
That's one way of putting it. Thomas Jefferson looks at, in fact, he wrote his own Bible. I think it's called the Jefferson Bible. And he rewrote it. It's a bit arrogant now that I say it that way. And it has Jesus as a moral figure. And all the miracles are, in a sense, excised from the text. There's no intervention of God in the deistic view. And one of the reasons why this developed, is an attempt to address the problem of evil. How could there be all this suffering if God is all good and is all watching and is intervening? In some cases, but not others, well, the view is that God just is not intervening at all. Again, more on that as we get to the problem of evil.
So would a deist believe in an afterlife then, or?
Yes, in many cases they do, but that's going to vary. So,
Shouldn't it be like arbitrary?
yeah, because then the conception of an afterlife, that's going to vary from person to person. That's also a very good question. I don't think there's a single answer to that. Because if I'm truly a deist who's talking about a designer who's unconcerned with, what's going on in this world, well, then the afterlife it would be weird if they then decided, oh, it looks like we've tabulated all that you've done, to borrow from the show The Good Place. They calculate how many points you've done. I didn't see any of it. I'm just now seeing the calculations, right? I'm now returning, oh, it looks like you did a little bit more bad than good. Sorry, bad place for you. I don't think that's an overly generalized characterization, I think, of it. I think it is an issue for deists, though. If they're thoroughgoing deists, the conception of afterlife is going to be very different than somebody who's has a belief in a personal God that intervenes. Fideism, we'll talk about this with the reading from Norman Malcolm on the 28th of this month. To be a fideist is to claim that arguments are useless in the belief of God, in the justification for God. We don't need argumentation, logic, philosophy, reason. Those are the wrong tools to investigate and study religion, theology, belief. By belief alone. Famously, Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher of the 1800s, would be considered a fideist, making the case that reason is insufficient. Logic, in fact, pushes us away from God. You see similar views of this in the early 1st century. Tertullian says something like, I believe because it is absurd. That view is similar to Kierkegaard's as well. To expand on that would take a lot more time than we have, but we will look at fideism, at least in the context of contemporary philosophy, with a guy named Ludwig Wittgenstein again. And Norman Malcolm was a good friend of Wittgenstein, so his paper is related to that. And then there's monotheism. That is the belief in a single God. One God, as opposed to a single God. Single God sounds like, he's available. Yeah, that was a joke there, I'm sorry.
Do you have any examples of like actual religions pertaining to these?
To which ones?
Like all like what is is there a religion like a deity?
Yes, all religions, at least the Armstrong, go through some variation of this. Indigenous populations, Native American viewpoints, for instance, would have variations of polytheism, pantheism. Panentheism, you find variations. You don't find too many established religions, although I'm sure there are, but you find that with Spinoza. You might see a variation of that in Einstein, kind of panentheism, where he's studying the mind of God, but the conception of God for Einstein is not any of the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, or any other organized faiths. It's more of this otherworldly power of some sort. Deists, we see that around the time of the Enlightenment period. And fideism we find with Kierkegaard, we find that with a number of, you won't find full traditions around it, although contemporary American thinkers, or if you ask, I think, your typical Christian in the United States, they're probably prone toward this, right? I believe, not because I've been convinced of an argument, I believe just through faith. And so fideism is found within a lot of mainstream religions. And as the famous existentialist Albert Camus put it, nobody ever died for the ontological argument. That's significant. I mean, people have died and fought for religious ideas, but nobody has died over an argument for or against the existence of God, as far as I know. That's what the ontological argument is an argument we'll get at after the first test. It's an argument for the existence of God based in pure logic. I mean, who is so moved by logic that they are willing to die? Not even Bertrand Russell would say that. In fact, he says explicitly, I would never die for a belief because, and I certainly wouldn't kill for a belief, Russell says, because I might be mistaken. How awful that would be, to kill or die for a belief that you were actually mistaken about, Russell thinks. All right, then there's monotheism. What is monotheism? Single God. That's different than atheism. To be an atheist is to believe there aren't gods. And there are different ways of looking at this. And with contemporary society, there's a lot of people who are non-theistic, who call themselves atheists, but mean different things by it. Some who call themselves agnostic or anti-theists. First of all, an atheist is somebody who doesn't have a belief in God, doesn't think God exists. That's one way of putting it. A monotheist believes there is a God. An atheist believes there aren't any gods. So Richard Dawkins is clearly an atheist. And I mentioned this before.
Wouldn't he be an anti? Atheism is more of a disbelief. It's an absent.
Let's
You
go.
don't
Yeah,
out
stick
of
with
your
that.
way.
See, here it's going to vary. So Dawkins does go out of his way, Richard Dawkins, to show that gods don't exist. And he is an atheist toward them. And many people respond. He gives an example when he was giving a talk from one of his books, and a woman comes up afterwards and asks him, how is it that you can be an atheist? I don't understand how it's even possible to not believe in God. To which he responds, yes, you do. You know exactly what it's like. I'm just like you. I just doubt one more God. Do you see what he means? Because as a monotheist, I am an atheist with respect to every other God that other people believe in that I don't believe in. So if, as a monotheist, technically I am an atheist with respect to all of the gods but mine. I don't believe in Thor. I don't believe in Zeus. I believe in my God. The atheist... So you know what it's like, I guess, is what Dawkins is saying. Now, the atheist may want there to be a God, but just doesn't believe it. The anti-theist may think there is a God, but wishes there weren't. Yeah, doesn't want there to be a God. So I can be an atheist and think, I don't have any justification. I can't get myself to believe in a God. I wish there was a God. I hope there's a God, but I don't have any belief that there is one. I can't assert that God exists. The anti-theist is somebody who says, there may be a God, but I hope not. Which is a weird thing to say until you realize, and something that Bloom discusses, well, you know what? If there's a God, then maybe there's a heaven and also a hell. And I don't want to believe in such a being that created that. Yes, I think yes.
Oh, I was wondering if anti-theists are more against the religion or the God itself.
So, good question. Very good question. There's a philosopher named Thomas Nagel who is specifically, he's a contemporary philosopher of mind, actually, predominantly. But he would be an anti-theist with respect to God. And I think also about religion, but you can divide that up. Some people could be...
Yeah, because I could see how some people are completely against the idea of religion and how it can do bad things to it. But I'm not sure how you can semi-believe in a God, be like, oh, I wish there wasn't, you know?
So Einstein may be anti-theist. In some of his writings, it sounds like he's against the hierarchical structures of religion, the institutionalization of religion. He's against.
That's what I can understand.
But his conception of God, he's ambiguous with respect. His conceptions are ambiguous. There was something in here I wanted to quote. Now I've lost it. But let me get the other hand while I'm looking for that.
Yeah, so you said that anti-theism is pretty much like being agnostic?
No, it's I guess you could be. It's that the agnostic, which is the next one, I think. Yeah, is basically you don't have knowledge. Agnosis, gnostic. The Gnostic Gospels were a group of Christians who claimed to have special knowledge. To be agnostic is to lack knowledge. Now, I could be an atheist and an agnostic at the same time. I could be an agnostic anti-theist. Does God exist? I don't know. But I hope not. I could be an agnostic with respect to atheism too. I could say, I currently... No, actually, that would be a tougher one to do. If you're talking about theism and atheism, you're talking about belief. If you're talking about agnosticism or Gnosticism, you're talking about knowledge. The agnostic claims to not know. Unfortunately, there are degrees to this, and so it's complex. I can be an extreme agnostic, which says, to the question, does God exist? You say, I don't know, and I'll never know, and you don't know, and you'll never know. Nobody knows, and nobody will ever know. That's an extreme version of agnosticism. No amount of evidence is going to ever change us. We'll never come to knowledge on it. Or you could be what is, I think, typically the case. Does God exist? I don't know, but I'm open to evidence to provide me with that knowledge for or against. That's, I think, typically how people use agnosticism.
Does negative theology fall under Gnosticism?
Depends. So there's the apophantic view of negative theology, which specifically deals with, you see this in Islam and Christianity, it's an attempt at getting at what God is, what's through the via negativa. We don't describe God in anthropomorphic terms. We can only say what God is not. And I think that's typically how people refer to negative theology. God is not cruel. God is not this or that. We cannot, because of the infinite chasm between us and the divine, come up with any positive conceptions of what God is, other than denying certain anthropomorphic characteristics. Negative theology might come up in maybe the where is it? February 20th, or when we get to the problem of evil, actually, it might come up. So that'll come up again. I saw another hand. Yeah.
So what separates atheism from agnosticism is that atheism hopes there's a God. Like I'm just not.
Oh, sorry. No, the atheist claims to not believe in God or gods. The agnostic claims to not know. So in a way, atheism is saying the opposite of what a theist says. I believe there are no gods, says the atheist. The agnostic says, I don't know if there are any gods. So yeah, there's a distinction between them. And again, sometimes the distinction is very thin, and people will define themselves in various ways. They'll call themselves agnostic, but what they really mean is, I think you're an atheist, right? And then there's theism, which is totally made up. Sorry.
Yeah, I've never.
I'm sorry.
I'm glad that's made up, because I was concerned why I didn't know.
Yeah, what the hell is that? Forgive the reference to hell. All right, so those are a bunch of isms we'll get to again. That's a bit of an overview. I went through that too slowly, I think. I want to tell you a little bit about the philosophy of religion, then we'll get into the Bloom reading, which we have limited time. What does philosophy of religion relate to in philosophy? Well, this sums it up right there. Everything. Just about any branch of philosophy that you're interested in, and there's more than this, is in some way connected to the philosophy of religion. You engage in philosophy of religion, even if you're an atheist, even if you're an agnostic, even if you're an anti-theist. If you're interested in any of those branches of philosophy and others, you'll find things of interest in the field, the subfield of philosophy of religion. Technically, it's a relatively new subfield. I mean, philosophers have always dealt with issues of God, but as so far as it's being a philosophy of religion, a discipline that's taught and has its own journals, that's about 100 years old. So it's relatively new. You don't need to write all those down. Finally, to wrap up our first introductory comments, this is something I want you to abide by, and I want you to consider this, the mutual fallibility principle, in connection with my statement on collaboration in the syllabus. And the principle, what is the mutual fallibility principle? Does anyone know that principle? I talk about it mostly in logic, but what is it? Go ahead.
That anybody can be fallible, you can be mutual or fallible.
And what's fallible mean?
You can be wrong.
You could be mistaken. You might be mistaken. And you might already believe that, but it's a good idea to habituate yourself to considering it. Don't go into a discussion with the view that, I'm wrong, totally wrong, I'm dead wrong, let's talk. Don't go into a discussion with, I'm right, I'm totally right, now let's hear how you're wrong. The other might be mistaken, and you might be mistaken. If you go in with the presumption of knowing for sure, you have probably denied yourself the possibility of learning anything. If you go in with the presumption of a debate, whatever it is, and in particular in questions dealing with value and faith and religion and so forth, if you go into that discussion with the presumption of certainty, why would you care what the other person has to say? Because when you have that presumption of certainty on your particular perspective, anyone else's viewpoint sounds like 1 + 1 = 8. And that's ridiculous, so you discount it, you ignore it, you mock it, and whatever else. And I find that to be problematic. And in fact, it relates to what I want to talk about a little bit, but I'm not really going to have time on this. Check that link out. It's very good. And it has to do with philosophy in particular. And some of you who know from my other classes, I don't like the adversarial approach to philosophy, although it's dominant in the Western culture. That's my background. Training has been adversarial. You learn how to create an argument, to defend that argument, and to counterattack those who try to find weaknesses in your argument. Argument is war, is that metaphor that undergirds it. And that's a problem. Because when I engage in a philosophical argument, then my opponents are my competitors. And the job in a war, the goal in a war is to do what?
Win.
Exactly. To
As opposed to
defeat,
finding the truth.
as opposed to improving and moving us away from ignorance, improving our reasoning. The goal is to win. And I find that's a problem because it brings with it all sorts of other negatives, right? Where if we don't win the argument, instead of hearing what the other person had to say, where I might be able to improve my viewpoint, all I hear is, oh, you're my enemy, you're evil, and I don't use that term lightly. We'll talk about evil in this class. Look at what's going on politically today. Probably today, right now, people are calling each other evil, banding that word around as if they know what they're talking about. And it's gotten to the point where we can't even listen to what another person with a different perspective has to say. And on issues of religion that may be of paramount importance to many people, I think it's important that we're capable of stepping back and critically analyzing the things that we think. And it's difficult to do, especially when we're dealing with beliefs that might be cherished beliefs for ourselves. Please read that if you get a chance. I'll come back to our discussion. I'll come back to our discussion about argumentation again, in particular next class, when we start looking at reasons for the existence of God, or rather reason and belief in God, and Clifford's conception, W.K. Clifford's conception and his argument related to belief and ethics. All right, so as I've left us very little time. I apologize. Paul Bloom asks the question, is God an accident? There he is. What does accident mean to this scientist? What is he talking about? Let's get right into it in the interest of time. What does it mean for something to be an accident in his conception?
There's an effect, but like no intention to cause.
It's an effect, and it came about without intention. It wasn't by design, and we have examples of other things that are, let's say, accidental. Think of it in terms of evolution, as psychologists, cognitive scientists oftentimes appeal to. Richard Dawkins does as well. What are some things that are accidental features? They weren't by design, but seem to have survived. And we might ask, what's the survival value of this? Why are we...
Well, sometimes people critique like the development of having a prefrontal cortex and think that all of our issues have to do with the fact that we can think about tomorrow, yesterday, our deaths. That's why we can be controlled. We have a fear of our death because we're aware of what it's like to be alive. I mean, but more realistically, it's kind of like the development of dogs. Canines no longer evolved once they chose to kind of have a relationship with humans and stuff. But
The dogs chose that?
no.
I think we... Have you seen the Shar-Pei? I think we did that to them. The Shar-Pei, by the way, is just a towel. It's just a towel. If you don't know, look it up. We don't have time to go into the Shar-Pei. But I see what you're saying. But I like I was thinking...
Yeah, what word? I can't think of.
Well,
really.
go ahead. Yeah. And then...
Is it just why he's saying God is an accident?
Where belief in the supernatural generally, but he speaks about God in the title. Where is this belief coming from if, from his perspective, there's no good reason or evidence for it? How does it continue?
Doesn't he say it was like an acceptation?
You have to explain that word. Instead of an adaptation, it's an exactation.
Yeah.
It's exacted.
Yeah, it was naturally selected for a different purpose, and then it's sort of like an evolutionary time lag. So he said there's a few reasons. One is like, I like the term the hypertrophy in social cognition.
That's right.
So the ability to intuit, pattern and intention into things. He says that's why we, like animism and stuff like that, we can perceive purpose when it
may not actually be there. We see the patterns of intentionality or design.
And then the really interesting one was essentially just due to theory of mind, like in our adaptation of the ability to think about minds, but specifically other minds. He says we're like common sense dualists, and that leads to belief in like souls.
And we're born this way. It's not that this is an interesting point he makes.
Yeah, and I
we're
don't
not
necessarily
okay.
agree. I mean, I think there's definitely some, but his argument was very black and white.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Because I remember, like, when I was around that age, I definitely had dualist intuitions, but I feel like it was mostly from like cartoons.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like the.
Well.
And you feel like constantly you're seeing like. Because it's so, and you know, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. Like,
yeah.
Why do cartoons display dualistic images? But I always had the idea of like the devil and the angel on the shoulder too, and like. But yeah, the mind is this very separate thing.
Yeah, his argument is that it's cross-culturally too, and so a lot of cultures in which cartoons might be as prevalent, nevertheless, children, even before they're exposed to cartoons, have this proclivity to divide up natural, I don't give examples of this, and physical, and mental, and minded, so to speak, with intention.
Yeah, and that would be interesting. But I feel like you need to provide more cross-cultural evidence.
Yeah, and he quotes a lot of people in the references there, so that have that data.
Yeah.
Their names are escaping me now, but there's a significant evidence that supports that. Now the question is, what do we take from this? Because there are other examples of things that come about that might be accidents of evolutionary history. Why is it that laughter evolved? That's an odd thing. Why is it that reason evolved? Reason probably initially evolved, the argument goes, to help better social cohesion, to help better take control over other people. It's now with philosophy and Socrates, we use reason to get to the truth. But that may be an exaptation of reason. It wasn't initially for that. That doesn't make the current use of reason useless, which raises the question, does that make the development of desire for there to be a God less than because we have a natural explanation for it? Real quick, and let me get the other hand.
Yeah, sorry. The really interesting thing to me was the idea of like not just other minds, but how it sort of we then made the jump to like a
supermind.
Yeah, supermind. And I don't know if he mentions it here, but I've seen before that was a way of incentivizing like group cohesion and sort of, or like as a way of like making sure people followed norms.
Right, that comes up. That's the fraternity. Religion as fraternity is an element of that.
It's a group selection argument instead of like
yes,
an individual selection.
And that is not necessarily inconsistent with theists' interpretation of their faith.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, this may have evolved this way, but that doesn't mean that this natural explanation supersedes or gets rid of the fact that there is a God. Yeah. That's a question I want us to consider. There's one more question in the back before I move on. Who had the hand up earlier? I'm sorry. I thought there was. I'm going to go through these slides now quickly. I'll just actually, I'm not going to go through them. You have them available to you. This is from the Pew Center Research. It gives you a lot of data. You can see the numbers. They've changed considerably. The numbers have gone down here, but the number of religious people generally hasn't really changed that much, which is surprising to a lot of intellectuals from the 1960s who thought that we're in the age of secularism and that religion is eventually going to die out. It did not. It has not. And there's interesting questions as to why that is. Part of what Bloom is addressing is where does the belief come from in the supernatural, and how does it come about? How does it persist? His argument, which we kind of already touched on already, is that humans are hardwired. It's part of our nature to be what we now call religious. We all have a sense of what, and you were talking about this too, we all have a sense of what it is to be alive and what it is to die, and we don't want to stop living. In Camus' sense, we want to accumulate and keep getting more and more experiences. And as Woody Allen puts it, I don't want immortality through the memory of my family and children. I want immortality through not dying. And that's a common view, this idea of immortality through not dying. It's not a view just found in the United States, by the way. I don't know why it is, but many people think that the U.S. is inherently more religious than other cultures. Or that the Republican Party is inherently more religious than the Democratic Party. I think they probably are to an extent, at least publicly so, but not by much. And in the United States, as he points out these figures, this is 2005, so things have changed as you saw previously. Even among scientists, you find a number of people who actually have what are typically religious beliefs. And Bloom finds this interesting and worthy of study. So why is it that scientists have it? One approach, why is it that anyone has it? One approach that he briefly discusses as religion as a kind of drug. Because, as he at one point says, it's hard to be a person. In fact, that's worth quoting at length, because it gets at what is known as the problem of suffering. This is page 147. He says, there is evil all around. 147, the bottom first column. If you don't have the text, just make note of where I'm referencing. Bottom of the second column, on 147. Everyone we love will die. And soon we ourselves will die. Either slowly and probably unpleasantly, or quickly and probably unpleasantly. For all but the pampered and lucky few, life is really nasty, brutish, and short. Who's he referencing there? Hobbes, yes. I've always loved that quote from Hobbes. Life is nasty, brutish. There's another one there that he's left out. Nasty, brutish, something, and short. The short part is always funny to me. Life is so terrible. In fact, references Woody, it's similar to Woody Allen. Woody Allen has a joke about life. He says, life is like a bad restaurant. You get terrible food in such small portions. That's funny because if it's so nasty, brutish, and terrible and violent, why would you want more of it? I always thought that amusing. Given how terrible life is, religion is there as a crux, crutch. Yeah, crux. A crutch. It helps us. It's a drug. It kills and dulls the pain. And in this sense, Marx's conception is not seeing religion wholly as negative, as he's oftentimes interpreted as. It's a means of salving, not salvation, but a salve for the horrors of existence. And this is how religion evolves. This belief in the afterlife, the belief in the supernatural, the belief in grace is there to help us through the horrors of existence. To which Bloom says, well, that's interesting, but doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless what? The religion as opiate hypothesis, religion, belief in the supernatural persists because we need these beliefs as an opiate. The opiates only work if what? Yes, we already have the belief. If I don't already believe in Zeus, then somebody telling me, hey, you should believe in Zeus, your life is terrible, I see that now. But if you believed in Zeus, it would be better. That's not how it works. Although, wait a minute, maybe opium does work that way. Your life looks terrible. I know what you need. You need some heroin. I'm sorry, I don't mean it. We should not end with that. But really, there's something to be said for, wait a minute, this is leaving out quite a bit. How is it that this religion as opiate works unless we already have that belief? You can't convince me that this is true and that I should use this to help me with this unless I already have the belief. And that is debatable. In fact, Pascal will disagree. So will William James. That's a fundamental point of disagreement. Yeah.
Couldn't you argue that psychologically that need was already there, so that's prior to having that belief?
Right. There is a God-shaped hole in all of, that's the phrase, in all of human nature. There's a desire that we all want, and we realize this world is insufficient to grant us that desire, and we can only get it from some supernatural. That's an expansion of Marx, and in fact, it is the view of C.S. Lewis, that there is this inherent natural inclination, a desire, and we don't have desires for things that cannot be sated. That's absurd. Any desire that humans have are desires that are, at least in principle, possible to be sated. to be fulfilled, his argument goes. Bless you. May God. Bless you. And therefore, the desires that we have with respect to the supernatural can't be fulfilled in this life. It seems that we still have the desires. It must be that there's a supernatural means of filling that gap, so to speak. C.S. Lewis says something similar about the collectivity of religion, the brotherhood that comes from it, the fraternity that comes from it, that the group is greater than the individual. And by the way, I just saw there's an actor who's going to give a portrayal of C.S. Lewis in Santa Barbara in October. I don't know if that's interesting to you. I've forgotten his name. If you like C.S. Lewis, he's written about Christianity in a very clear and concise way. In any case, Bloom has a problem with this. Let me try and wrap this up. The fraternity element of it explains a lot. We touched on some of these already before. It helps keep people in-group and out-group dynamics. We can understand it in terms of keeping people in line. I think he talks about people being paddled and other things like the tips of penises being lopped off or snipping off parts. That was weird. But that all is interesting, but explains all sorts of things, except the most important thing, the religious part. Because there are fraternities, actual ones, that can do a lot of the things that Lewis and others are talking about, but don't have any explanation for why there is the supernatural or why there is the belief in the divine. And so this takes us to what we've introduced briefly. I will have to start with this part. We're not that far behind on the schedule, so that's all right. And I don't care that we're a little bit behind. That's not a big deal. I'm not going to rush through it. So for next time, Ethics of Belief with William Clifford. It's a relatively short reading. Make sure you do that. And there is the question that you want to pick from those 3 questions at the end. Write that out. Submit it to me before next class on Tuesday, and then we'll have a discussion of it in class. I'll start off on this section at the beginning of class next time. If you are adding, I think there was one other person I spoke to, come see me. Otherwise, have a lovely weekend.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you. Let's see.
I was wondering if I could add too.
Yes. I don't have any more syllabi with me, but when I